should start now. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our webinar, Counting the Cost, the Impact of Funding Cuts on the Global Women's Movement. My name is Sameh Kmishah and I'm the Head of Training and Learning at the Women's Budget Group, and I'm your facilitator today. Across the world recently, particularly in the Global South, we've witnessed a lot of political backlash that impacted more specifically women's rights organizations and feminist movements who are facing severe funding crisis following the all this political backlash and geopolitical changes happening. Today, we will examine the short and medium-term consequences of these cuts and explore how gender-responsive budgeting can help us assess and advocate for better resource allocation and identify together a way forward. A few quick housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded and we will share the link afterwards. It will run for about 1 hour. We probably will run over by a few minutes. There is a Q&A box. Please share your questions and comments, and we will try to answer as many as possible. And I'm delighted that we are joined today by an incredible panel of feminist leaders and advocates who will walk us through the current situation and reflect together on ways forward. So let me introduce them. We have first Rachel Jacobson, who is the co-director of the Alliance for Feminist Movements. Rachel is a public health professional specialized in human rights, and she has been engaged in feminist movements for over 20 years, both globally and locally in Texas, where she was raised in the USA. And then we have Laila Al-Odait, who is the executive director of Prospera International Network of Women's Funds. Laila is a seasoned feminist leader with 2 decades of experience in advocacy, movement building, and a proven track record as a litigator and a strategist. She joined the feminist peace movement through the International Women's League for Peace and Freedom, where she was appointed Deputy Secretary General in 2021. Laila is from Syria and holds an LLM in Human Rights, Conflict and Justice from SOAS. She's also a qualified forest school leader and active community organizer. And then we have Siwar Dous, who is a manager of the Feminist Crisis Response at the Global Fund for Women. Siwar is a Tunisian gender justice practitioner and feminist philanthropy professional. With over a decade of experience, she supports feminist and LGBTQI-led movements in crisis context, especially in the Global South. Her work is grounded in a Southern feminism focused on solidarity, flexible funding, and grassroots organizing. She holds an MA in Gender and Development from the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex. And then we have from Care International UK, Claudia Craig, who is a senior advocacy advisor on gender justice. Claudia is an experienced feminist advocate and strategist with over 10 years working in foreign and development policy. She leads CARE's UK advocacy on women, peace and security, feminist foreign policy and feminist funding practices. She previously led advocacy for the International Rescue Committee and UNICEF UK and has worked for both the UK and Scottish governments. Claudia holds a law degree from the University of Aberdeen and an MSc in Gender Development and Globalization from LSE. She's also an active UK abortion rights campaigner with media and legal reform experience. And last but not least, our very own Marianne Stevenson, who is the director of the Women's Budget Group. Marianne has worked with the WBG for over 20 years and became its first director in 2017. She previously served as director of the Fawcett Society and was a commissioner on the Women's National Commission. She's a trustee of both Coventry Rape and Sexual Abuse Center and Justice Fair. So welcome everyone and welcome to our panelists. And let's start with Rachel. If you could give us an overview of the funding cuts happening right now and the impact it has on the feminist movements worldwide.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for the invitation to join you today. I'm Rachel Jacobson. I'm one of the co-directors at the Alliance for Feminist Movements, which is a multi-stakeholder platform bringing together governments, philanthropy, and civil society to increase and improve financial and political support for feminist movements. So I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you all today, which is where these slides come in, but I'll spend some time putting those into context as well. And also just to say, I'm going to talk about one part of the feminist funding ecosystem, which are the institutional donors like foundations and governments, where we're seeing the big cuts. But it's important to remember that the way that the money moves out of these institutions and big grants is different from the way that money moves into most women's rights organizations who tend to operate on really small budgets, under $30,000 a year on average, according to AWID. And when they do receive that funding, it tends to come from intermediary sources like women's funds or UN agencies instead of from the governments or foundations directly. And my colleague Leila from Prospera, I'm sure, is going to be able to enrich that part of the picture. But I think also when we talk about the feminist funding ecosystem, it's important that we see ourselves as part of this cycle that creates wealth, that we recognize that the taxes that provide ODA come from us, that the profits that are driving the accumulation of wealth come from us as well, right? So we're in the cycle. It's not a one-way delivery system. So with those caveats all done, I'll move on to the numbers. And Siobhan, if I could have the next slide. So my first number here is 1 in 4. And that is the number of countries reporting to UN Women that backlash is impeding their implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. And the next slide. This next number is 7 in 10. That's the number of people that live in closed or oppressed countries according to Civicus. Freedom declined around the world for the 19th consecutive year in 2024. And I share these numbers because we know that they go hand in hand, that the anti-democratic, anti-gender, anti-rights actors are one and the same, and that they target women, feminists, people with disabilities, migrants, and asylum seekers, and racialized communities so that they can consolidate their strength and power and riches. So my second set of numbers, I'm going to talk about our funding situation before the cuts. So first, we've got $481 million. This is the amount of ODA that went to women's rights organizations on average in 2022 to 2023. It is only 0.7% of all gender-related ODA, which is the lowest proportion since we began tracking in 2010. And it's important to remember that gender-related ODA is only 46% of all ODA. So we've got 5% of ODA going to programs whose main purpose is to drive gender inequality. 41% of all ODA going to programs that are supposed to drive gender equality as a part of a set of larger goals, which means that 54% of all ODA is either completely gender blind or could be driving gender inequality. So my second set of numbers are about our funding from private philanthropy. So one measure is $223 million, which is the amount of private philanthropy to women's rights organizations reported to the OECD. That represented 1.8% of all philanthropic giving reported to the OECD. Another way to look at philanthropy is on my next slide, and that number here is 325.6 million. That's the total gender grant-making budgets for the top US-based foundations supporting gender equality. And that number represents 0.3% of total US-based foundation giving. So any way you look at it, giving to gender equality and women's rights is a very small percentage of the overall philanthropic giving and ODA. And it's concentrated among a very small group of governments and foundations, meaning that our ecosystem is incredibly sensitive to small changes. And we are experiencing a lot of changes. So on to the cuts on the next slide. So $2.83 billion. This is the minimum amount per year that we're expecting to see lost to the women's rights and gender equality sector starting in 2026. So in partnership with other colleagues, we've been tracking these losses coming from government and philanthropy, and we expect this number to rise. And we expect the number to rise because according to our colleagues at the Human Rights Funders Network, $78 billion per year is expected to be cut from all foreign assistance. This is 1/3 of all foreign aid. If you can go to the next slide, we'll just leave that 78 billion up there. And I think most of us have a pretty good idea about why these cuts are happening. They're happening because of European security concerns. The UK was the first country to announce cuts to ODA to pay for defense spending, but it's not going to be the last. And those cuts from the UK are especially important because the UK last year was the third largest bilateral donor to women's rights organizations. Second, we expect these cuts to continue because of extreme right-wing parties gathering strength in Europe and in other donor governments. And because once ODA is cut, it rarely returns to those previous levels. The example set by the US has opened the door for others to follow through. So where are these losses coming from? Well, they're primarily coming from the governments of the United States and the Netherlands and the closing of Wellspring and the Women's Rights Program at the Sigrid Rousing Trust. Now, the Dutch had historically been the most important bilateral donor to women's rights organizations in volume, but also in the quality of that funding. They showed it was possible to move money directly to Southern groups, bypassing gatekeepers in the North. Our estimated losses from the Dutch alone was $75.3 million per year. But with the recent move to a caretaker government and new elections in October, we don't know yet what's going to happen with their proposed cuts. And the political situation in the Netherlands just underlines this instability from this geopolitical earthquake that we're living through. I'm sure many of you are aware of the dismantling of US aid and the illegal withholding of development assistance funds that this administration is doing. While there are many, many lawsuits challenging these actions, it's unlikely that money that is being withheld is coming back to gender equality. Some of the global health funding may come back, but as a colleague in the US told me recently, that money will come back out poisoned with extreme restrictions on what can be said and who can be served. And in the meantime, the systems that had been depending on US assistance, even unknowingly sometimes, are collapsing and crumbling. The US government is also going after nonprofit organizations and foundations with new threats and emergencies emerging every week. They've been explicit in the targeting of progressive philanthropy. Some foundations are stepping up, some are pushing out more money quietly, and others are doing their best just not to be noticed. And it's really important to be aware of those because so much of the funding for gender equality from foundations comes from groups in the US. And these losses, as I said before, are so significant for us because we've relied on such a small group, meaning that when one donor leaves, like OSF or the Netherlands, our ecosystem isn't robust enough to absorb these losses. And we're starting to see that come through the impact assessments that I think others are going to speak about and that we've detailed in a report I'll share in the chat. So we'll go to the last slide. I'm wrapping up here. Even though I love numbers, we do not need to wait for all of our methodologically sound, rigorous assessments to know a couple things about the impact on women's rights organizations, feminist organizing, and women and girls. We know that one, gender equality is being deliberately targeted and that programs and organizations working on gender equality and gender justice are closing, they will close, and they'll experience greater backlash. Two, we know that crises aren't gender neutral. When systems and services crumble, women and girls fill in the gaps or they go without in order to care for those around them. This is going to impact our ability to organize for our rights and justice, let alone our actual health, well-being, and lives. Three, we know from COVID that the strongest gender-sensitive responses came in places where women's movements were already mobilized, underlining the need to keep women's movements alive and organizing during this time. Four, we know that as governments rebuild the systems and services that are crumbling, we need strong women's movements there to make sure that what is newly built actually works for us. And lastly, we know that ODA and philanthropy are going through rapid changes, with many people talking about post-aid and post-philanthropy worlds. We have got to work together as an ecosystem of institutional donors, intermediaries, and civil society groups to build what's to come in ways that are rooted in justice and equity. I'll stop there. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This was a bit eye-opening to see the numbers on the screen like this, and I think Layla can complement what you said and tell us about the effect that it has on feminist donors and funders around the world, but also at Prospera. And yeah, the floor is yours, Layla.
Thank you so much, Samah, and thank you everyone for bringing this together. And yes, Rachel, amazing, sobering numbers, and putting things in perspective is really important. And I want to push us a little bit further within this view that Rachel has given us. So I run a network of 50 women and feminist funds that channel resources to the Global South. And women and feminist funds are the movement's response to them taking charge of their own resourcing. They're not the only intermediary to make money and resources available to the movement, but they are one of the main ones. I'm going to further quote a report that Rachel mentioned from AWID, from the Association of Women in Development, who looked at where is the money, where's the resources going to the feminist movement. And it said that, so as Rachel said, 60% of those on the front line in the movement operate on less than 30,000 a year. These are the ones who are holding the most of the burden and carrying change, pushing us forward. 55% of organizations and groups within the feminist movement consider women and feminist funds as their main source, one of their main sources of funding. And more than 40%, it's their largest source of funding. So if you put this in perspective, they are entities that has been created by the movement to give them a little bit more say and a little bit more role in how resources arrive to them. And the numbers that we've seen, the sobering numbers that we've seen, must be taken into account with two things. The first one is, while the international aid and resources going from the global north and the global south are being hugely starved, the labor that's going from the global south to the global north to ensure profit and to ensure the current status quo continues is ever increasing. And this is a gendered labor. This is women working in very difficult circumstances, resourcing wealth that's not going to end up theirs. Taking this cycle that is getting even more unequal, it's never been equitable, but it's getting starkly unequitable, comes a second thing to take into account. This scarcity is huge, but it's not new. As Rachel said, we have less than 1% of ODA and philanthropic giving goes to women and feminist groups. So what's changing? Why would it change from 1% to slightly lower, make so much echo in the movement? Because the price is incredibly high. The way we speak about funding suggests that it's a program changed here, it's a few salaries there. The truth is that is people who are going to lose their access to safety, their ability to challenge economic pressure, the ability to challenge violence. There's people who are going to watch their children exposed to completely preventable death. There's health systems that the feminist movement has pushed over tens and tens of years to start including the bodies of women and gender minority in completely and quickly retreating on that. This is what's at stake. And while there was a million, even at the time that we called time of abundance, when it was a whole 1% that's getting covered, all what we had is a little bit of a role and a say in how this small amount of giving is reaching the movement. And now this control is being lost. So to take you to my numbers, and I apologize, I don't have a slides, but the information will be available on our website. We surveyed our members. So these are 50 members who range from large global funds like the Global Fund for Women into small national funds that cover one country, Women's Fund Mongolia, Women's Fund Tanzania, and everything between them, including regional funds. And they validated exactly what the numbers that Rachel mentioned about the width. But what does that mean to them? 30% of their budget is going to be cut in 2026. This is money that has been built over so many years, and it's going to be cut immediately and quickly. And what I keep telling the philanthropists and bilateral donors that I speak to, let's say that there's 650 million that's going to evaporate in a minute. If we put an imaginary check of 650 million in a year, we will not even start scratching the surface on the kind of structural loss that we are going to suffer this year, because these are expertise and channels that are going to go. They're not going to be there to rehire in a year. The people's ability and access within state institutions, within parallel institution is going to go. We're going to have to rebuild it from the beginning. And while the struggles are localized, the gains and the losses are absolutely global. Our numbers told us that it's not going to be a surprise. The cuts, those are most at risk from direct cuts, 90% globally, from LGBTQ plus rights and inclusion, 67% on sexual and reproductive rights, and 67% on grassroots organizations. That's almost all the LGBT community, 2/3 of the work done on sexual and reproductive health rights, and 2/3 on feminist grassroots organizing. And it's really important to see this as a globalized loss. The shrinking space for the feminist movement in Poland, or the closure of civil society in Egypt, or the going after the LGBT movement in Tanzania will impact me here, sat in London, immediately. It won't impact me in the future. This is not only a narrative issue. This is legal loss of rights, and absolute economic impact that we all know for a fact impacts women and gender minorities hugely disproportionately. So where does that take me in terms of what do we do now? There's no shortage of money in the world. There is enough resources to cover everyone, to alleviate poverty, to give everyone a dignified life. There is lack of equity. There is issues that us as a movement for rights take it upon ourselves to guard. And at the same time, the movement has managed to do amazing solutions, practical infrastructure solutions in a very unsupportive environment. And these are the two things that I would always encourage us to work on. We need to continue to take this as a rights issue, because it is, and that's for all of us. As Rachel said, there is always going to be a diversity, there's going to be a spectrum of response, but we cannot collectively afford for this spectrum to shrink. And the one thing, last thing I'm going to say, us as a network, what we see is an incredible amount of meaningful solidarity. When COVID hit, our members came together and found immediate solutions. They went far out of their comfort zone, but also out of their mandates to make sure that no one is left behind. When there was well-meaning giving that left so many behind, they came together and worked towards resource justice. This is how feminists actually do it. And this is what we need to keep in mind. We need to continue to push that spectrum to its maximum. And the other thing is, while we do that, and while the world is looking at post-aid, and, great, we always need to have structural existential conversations, but we cannot afford to leave for the infrastructure to collapse while we do this streaming, because although it might not collapse the institutions that serve us now, it has immediately impacted institutions that will collapse. We won't be able to rebuild them. So that's where I'd push all of us collectively to think, and feminist financing and feminist political economy sits at the very heart of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laila. Yeah, it's again sobering to see all this inequality getting bigger. And as you said, the funding cuts and the knock-on effect it has an immediate effect on us, but also on people, especially in conflict areas and crisis zones. So, Siwar, if you can tell us what is happening with you at the Global Fund for Women and within the program that you are managing, and if you can tell us a few stories as well from the people you work with.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm speaking today as a feminist crisis response manager at Global Fund for Women, but also as Global Fund for Women as a member of Prosper, and also part of a global community of feminists who are doing everything really that we can to sustain life, dignity and justice, and within really like a systematic abandonment. So it's really times that we're really trying our best to see further or beyond what's happening. And I think Leila, you touched on this, and I really want to want to reinforce and highlight it, is that really feminist movements have always known that what a lot of people are waking up to right now, which is humanitarian crises, are human rights crises. And so this is the reality of things. It has not been really presented this way, but feminist movements have always connected both. And so this has always been our lens. So for example, in Palestine, Sudan, Afghanistan, Ukraine, the DRC and beyond, we see how armed conflict, displacement, and climate disasters intersect with gender-based violence, economic collapse, and political repression. It's all interconnected. And we know that feminist and queer movements are at the front lines, responding, protecting, resisting, and yet they are the ones that are hit the hardest by these crises. And their efforts are invisible and consistently underfunded. And so today we're watching these crises deepen, not only because of what's happening on the ground, but because of what's being taken away as well. And so the recent US foreign aid freeze is only part of the global trend, as was mentioned by Rachel and Leila. Governments around the world are slashing both development and humanitarian funding with devastating really consequences. We're often told that these cuts are an economic necessity, but I really would like us to ask whose survival is negotiable and whose safety is being deprioritized. It's really interesting when we hear these arguments. From the feminist crisis response lens, these cuts confirm that many of us, or what we really know already, which is like traditional humanitarian systems prioritize neutrality over justice, prioritize scale over care, and state interest over community needs. But there is another way around this. So as Global Fund for Women and many other feminist funds, and as Leila was mentioning about the feminist funds we're trying to do, centering the feminist economic or feminist analysis approach within the work. Our work is rooted in feminist alchemy research. So we as Global Fund for Women, we host a community of practice, which is co-created by 15 feminist funds. So we have a research that is done by Feminist Alchemy, which shows that today's crises are not isolated. And so they are symptoms of militarism, extravagance, colonial legacies, and donor models that consistently ignore localized feminist knowledge. And so feminist groups distributing, either you think of feminist groups distributing food in Gaza, dignity kits in Sudan, or you think of trauma counseling in Syria, shelters for LGBTQI refugees in Latin America, education for girls in Afghanistan, are all now scrambling to keep the lights on just as needs intensify. And this is really, really scary to think about. This is not just about lost funding, it's about the possibility of lost futures. And this is really alarming. And so in March 2024, which is already was before the budget, these cuts, Global Fund for Women with the Global Resilience Fund, we published a report called The Active but Underfunded Role of Young Women and Girls that they play in crisis. And so the numbers was, as Leila was mentioning, was already from the beginning small, and Rachel as well was mentioning, only 0.34% of global aid in 2022 went to women organizations, rights organizations. In crisis contexts like Ukraine, the number dropped just to 0.05%. Less than 22% of humanitarian aid projects even mention gender equality as a primary goal. And now on the recent funding cuts, according to the report of Defunding Freedom by Outright and HRFN, the US aid cuts have shattered LGBTQI plus shelters, suspended migration pathways, dismantled healthcare access across Latin America, Africa, and MENA. And UN Women report that almost 50% of women rights organizations in crisis zones may close in 6 months. Imagine that. And this is as it was mentioned as well, this is an infrastructure that could be lost. And so how much time do we need to rebuild? There is also a recent study in the Lancet HIV found that declining international funding could lead up to 10.7 million new HIV infections and nearly 3 million preventable deaths by 2030, including children. But there is in all of this, there is what can give me hope and I can share. And if we cannot really hope, I think this is the only thing that we can look at. And I really think that feminist movements are not only surviving or looking for survival, they're imagining new ways to respond. And we need to listen. We really, really, really need to listen, because because crisis is not just a collapse, it's also a space for imagination. And I want to quote this article that I was reading like 2 days ago or so on empowering nonprofits for justice. And it says, survival alone is not enough. The moment demands imagination. More specifically, it demands Black imagination, not just as a statics, but strategy, not just performance, but practice. And so we really ask ourselves, what if we stopped treating imagination as a luxury and started seeing it as critical infrastructure? What if we think, reflect on this question so we can really be more helpful into figuring out what possibilities are for this world that we call post-aid? And so our Global Fund for Women, our grantee partners, and also the community of practice of feminist alchemy remind us that feminist crisis response is not about scale over care or neutrality over justice. It's really about the interconnection. It's about autonomy, flexibility, trust. It's about letting frontline communities lead and daring to build new systems rooted in care, really, not in control. I always remember one sentence that one Afghan activist told me, and can never really forget it. And I always carry it by my heart. And she said, "We may not see the fruit of our activism in our generation, but that doesn't stop us. We do this for future generations. We do it because we care." And that to me is the essence of feminist crisis response. We do this work not because it's easy. We do it not because we're well funded. We do it because we care. Because we dream, and because we refuse to let our movements be erased. Because we are here today, we're having this conversation because of generations of movements before us who really paved the way for us to be here, and we really owe it to the next ones to continue what we do. And so what I would like to end by asking is, one, for donors to fund with courage. Courage is needed today, really, really needed. To fund directly, offer flexibility, and fund intersectionally. To all of us to really make space to dream, dreaming even in the middle of despair, because that's what we have. And for all movements to know that even if your work is invisible to systems of power, it is still seen, it is vital, and it's transformative. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Siwar, for this very powerful presentation, but also very disheartening. And we think of all our sisters all around the world who are going through a lot because of the funding crisis, but because also of all the conflicts happening. We'll go back to the UK now. Claudia, if you can tell us what's happening, especially after the funding cuts of the UK foreign aid, and what it means from a care perspective.
Yeah, I feel awful following that, because I feel like you just took us to such a place of radical reimagination in terms of what the system should look like or how we take the system down. Instead, I'm like, let me speak about one of the oldest colonial powers and their aid budget. But if you'll bear with me in going back a few decades, and then we can come back to radical reimagination of what the system should look like. Yeah, I wanted to bring into the fray a government that is making a lot of decisions right now based on so-called economic necessity, instead of really framing and admitting that these are political choices. And we have a new government in the UK. We have, theoretically new, we have a Labour government in power. But unfortunately, it shows that they are following a lot of the decisions that were made by the previous Conservative government. Care International, which many of you will know is an international NGO, but also has a UK office, has been monitoring what the UK has been doing with its aid budget and how the UK has been spending on gender equality for a long time. Our latest research, which we released in February this year, found that the UK had made the political choice to reduce its aid spending on gender equality year on year since 2019. And that as of February 2025 this year, the spending was standing at almost half of what it was pre-pandemic. That's not just ODA, that's not just aid, that's specifically what the UK was spending on gender equality. And so we saw a fall between 2019 and 2017 and 2022 from 6.3 billion to 3.4. So it made 2022 the joint lowest year on record since the UK began recording its spending on gender equality in 2014. And I think also in coming back to this, element of choices and how donors like the UK are choosing to spend their money or choosing not to spend their money, the reduction that we've seen in ODA spend on gender equality is disproportionate, of course, to the overall fall in ODA over that same period of time. While the ODA budget was cut by a third between 2021 and 2022, programming to prevent violence against women and girls was cut by 41%. Funding to women's rights organizations fell by 66% from its peak in 2017. So we are really seeing disproportionate impact on women's rights orgs, women-led orgs, the global feminist movement, as many of the previous speakers have spoken to. But this is just a snapshot of the way that one, donor like the UK is contributing to that. Additionally, and I think Mary might speak to this more later on, but we've also found that the UK government put in very, very few safeguards when it carried out these previous rounds of cuts. Many of you will know, especially my sisters in the global majority countries, about the way in which these cuts were conducted. There wasn't time for ethical exits. There was very rapid terminations of funding. It was disproportionate in terms of the burden that was felt by colleagues in global majority countries compared to those in the global minority. And there wasn't really any real effort from the UK to avoid that disproportionate impact. And now this was research we released in February this year, but here we are in June. And I'm really sad to say that we're actually facing a really similar situation that could potentially be worse. And the UK government is currently on track to deliver its worst aid budget on record for women and girls. This is because in March, right before International Women's Day, a lovely International Women's Day present for us all, the UK announced its decision to once again cut its aid budget. And this was particularly galling, considering the fact that the aid budget had already been through several rounds of cuts, and the fact that this year it was explicitly reduced in order to fund an increase in military budgets and in defence budgets, which speaks to that rise in militarism as well that previous panelists have been speaking to. But what was particularly concerning for us as women feminist activists working in this space is that in May, the minister actually put on record at a parliamentary committee, the International Development Committee, that the plan is for those targets to fall disproportionately once again on programs that support gender equality and have gender equality as their outcome. And they plan and have actively said on record that they believe women's rights organizations and women-led organizations will be disproportionately hit by those cuts. The way in which they've couched it is that, as it will come as no surprise to anyone who's worked with governments, that they plan to mainstream everything. And they're going to mainstream gender equality through their programming in health and in climate and in humanitarian. But this decision to cut standalone programming, which we know is the programming that focuses on social norms change, that has that much more transformative potential, that has that long-term impact, is really concerning for all of us. And what's worse as well is that we know that the UK public don't actually support this decision. And while the UK public in general, as many public votes are, especially in donor countries, are skeptical overall about the aid budget, when you ask them about what you think aid should be spent on, we have seen consistently high polling in the UK public for support for women and girls' rights globally, support for the UK being a leader in global gender equality. So the UK backtracking on this not only goes against the solidarity that they should be showing with women and girls worldwide, but also the solidarity with their own voter base. So it's a really concerning turn of events. We're still urging the UK government to rethink this decision and not to carry out these cuts at the disproportionate level that they're currently proposed. We understand that it's irreversible at this point, and because of their political views, to change the decision to cut the budget. But we're asking them desperately to rethink the decision on where those cuts fall. So that's the situation that we're in the UK right now. And a lot of us also who work in the space are, as previous panelists said, thinking about that pivot to a more radical reimagination of how we stand with our sisters in the global majority and how we move forwards from this mess that we all currently find ourselves in. But yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you everyone for all these powerful insights. What's clear is that the funding cuts have immediate and not abstract at all consequences, and they're deeply felt across all communities, women's communities around the world. And in regards to radical imagining, at the Women's Budget Group, we've been working for a long time trying to influence economic policies. And one of the things that we call for is gender responsive budgeting. And I would like you, Marianne, to tell us a bit what it is and how it can help us move forward and how it can help us embed spending for gender equality across budgets, both local, like nationally and globally.
Thank you, Sama, and thank you all for your presentation so far, which is really stark on the kind of devastating impact that this is having. It's one of those things where you know it's terrible, and then every time you see the numbers or hear the stories again, you're struck as though for the first time, what is going on here. At the Women's Budget Group, we've always recognised that, movements, organisations for gender equality, and indeed women's services can be both life-changing and in some cases life-saving. We also know that they've been historically underfunded. I mean, that's as true in the UK as it is anywhere else in the world. I think all too often it's treated as a kind of nice to have, rather than essential, something that you can do when times are good, but is easily cut when money gets tight. And, there's a fundamental failure to recognise that actually this isn't something that you get, when you have your healthy economy. It's actually fundamental to building a healthy society and a healthy economy. And we saw this during the period of austerity in many countries around the world after the global financial crisis, where there were cuts both to specialist women's services and organisations, but also to public services such as health, education or care, on which women are more likely to rely. And these represents a triple whammy for women, because, women are more likely to need these organisations and services. They're often the majority of workers in services that are cut, and as we've heard, sometimes overnight with no notice and no time to plan. And it's women who have to plug the gaps with unpaid work when organisations disappear or have to cut back on their programmes. So Sama asked me to say a little bit about gender responsive budgeting as a tool, both to highlight and ideally prevent some of these impacts. And some of you will be very familiar with the concept of GRB, others might not be. So I wanted to take a couple of minutes to explain what we mean. So when we talk about gender responsive budgeting, we're not talking about a special budget for women or about analysing those bits of government spending that are specifically directed at women, such as maternity services or girls' education. We're talking about looking at all budgeting decisions. So how money is raised as well as how money is spent, who wins and who loses through a gendered lens. And as well as looking at the formal economy, goods and services bought in the marketplace, we also look at the informal economy of unpaid work. In the UK, that's mainly care and domestic work as well as volunteering. But in other countries, it might also involve subsistence farming or systems of barter and exchange that are outside the formal economy. And the Women's Budget Group, we're an independent think tank. We carry out this work every year around the budget. We also lobby the government to do their own analysis and, most importantly, act on it. It's not that hard to do the analysis. It's the political will to do something once we know what's going on that's the hardest bit. But we also work with partners who are doing similar work in other countries to learn from them and to share our experiences. And so as we've heard, we've seen really severe cuts in the UK overseas aid budget. A round of cuts under the previous Conservative government, and then again this year under a Labour government. Now, under the Equality Act, the UK government, like all public bodies in England, Scotland, and Wales, are required to have what's called due regard to the impact of their policies on equality. And this, if it was done properly, would require the sort of analysis that would be a form of gender responsive budgeting. And one of the main ways public bodies in the UK meet this obligation is through equality impact assessments. Unfortunately, our government has not published any equality impact assessment of these cuts. We don't know if there is going to be one published. However, there was an impact assessment of previous cuts in 2021, which the then government hadn't planned to publish, but which was leaked. And what this said was it recognised that the proposed scale of reductions to specific gender interventions, including violence against women and girls and sexual and reproductive health rights, will impact girls' education and wider efforts to advance gender equality. And it identified there will be likely reductions of 75% for bilateral programming for violence against women and girls programs, 70% for sexual and reproductive health rights, and funding for women's rights organisations, and it would reduce the services available to women and girls who are subject to sexual violence, including sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment. And it also said it would undermine the ability to progress safeguarding objectives and championing of a survivor-based approach. So it is not as though the government is unaware of the impact this will have. And bear in mind, this was the impact, the 75% cuts, the 70% cuts for sexual health was from 2021. So the additional cuts that are coming in now will be on top of those cuts. So services and budgets that have already been cut to the bone. And as I said, parliamentarians have been pushing the government about whether equality impact assessments have been carried out. The minister has said they'll be part of budget allocation decisions, but we've yet to see any detail. I think it's unlikely that they will want to publish these impact assessments because they don't look good. And that's a real shame, because I think that equality impact assessments can be, if used properly, a really powerful tool to actually kind of deliver equality through kind of fiscal processes. And so that would involve, first of all, thinking about the overall likely impact of cuts to aid spending. And in the UK, also thinking about the justification. So as has been said, the justification for this round of cuts in the UK has been that we need to put more money into defence spending. And there's been two justifications for this. One is about increased security, and the other is that this increased spending will be a way of growing the economy because it's a way of creating additional jobs in arms manufacturing. And this is clearly a transfer of money from the poorest women in the world into sectors which are not only incredibly damaging to globally, but particularly to women and children, but also the jobs that it creates are not jobs for women, they will be jobs for men, and they may well not be jobs in the UK. So it seems like a really misdirected set of decisions. And secondly, I think it should require government to think about the specific projects where funding will be cut. Which projects, who is impacted? Why is the plan for gender equality budgets to be hit hardest by these decisions? What's the rationale for that? And so we will be pushing the government on this. As a UK-based organisation, our greatest leverage is over the UK government, and working in partnership with organisations like CARE, but also in partnership with sister organisations around the world, where, you know, we are in a position to put pressure on. And also thinking about, if the government doesn't do this analysis, you know, what can civil society do? How can we do this? How can we produce the evidence of the impact that these decisions are going to have? Because as previously been said, this is not a policy that is popular with UK voters. And I think the more people are aware of the actual impact on the lives of women, the less popular it will become. I also think, and this is always a tricky, question, I think, for women's movements. Do you know, do we try and challenge the government within its own terms, or do we try and set our own terms for the debate? I sometimes think you need different organisations to do both. You need organisations to shift the debate onto different grounds, but you probably also need people who will talk to government in a language that resonates with what they care about. And so that would mean in the UK talking about how cutting back on this funding makes the world more insecure rather than less, and talking about how gender equality is not something that's nice to have when you have a healthy and strong economy. It's the basis of a healthy and strong economy. It's fundamental to where we want to be. And so I suppose I would like to end by saying that, you know, we at the Women's Budget Group really want to play whatever part we can to push these issues with our government, and to also push through, you know, the work that Sama is doing in training other governments on gender responsive budgeting and speaking to them to push this agenda as well. So, you know, please do stay in touch, and, you know, let's keep talking about what we can actually do in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Speaking about what you can do in practice, my question to all the panelists now is, what are the most immediate things that we can do? What are the conversations that are currently happening? What are the networks that are forming? And how can we join that? And probably people also attending can help or like know about this and join as well. I don't know who wants to go first.
I can come in very quickly on this and leave it to others. I think the first thing that at least this is from women rights organizations and Global South activists, what has been really helpful lately, and I think we should do more of it, is actually to sit and listen to a Global South activists who've been surviving and under very oppressive context, and they've been surviving and finding ways to mitigate. And this crisis is just another crisis, but they've been continuing to do so. So it's a very interesting time now. I think for me, I really think that the Global North really needs to learn some strategies from the Global South. I think it's time for us to exchange and to really give really the credit for Global South organizations for continuing to exist and thrive and really putting rights on the agenda, even if it looks different than from the Global North. But it's the time for this power to shift and for us to listen to Global South and really learn from the strategies that have been implementing. And the second thing is, I really think it's time for us as well to think of alternative resources. What does that mean? How can we think about alternative resources? Because as it was mentioned, I think Rachel mentioned that it was that the money is still the same. Like, there is still money in the world. There is no lack of money. And so how can we really get that money? And that needs a lot of thought partners and there is amazing, people even here, the people who are attending and people who are in the panel, and many more in the movements that we need to really think together.
Leila, do you want to go?
Yeah. No, I was gonna have a go at Claire's question, but I think Marianne wants to continue on this one, so please go ahead.
Just wanted to say how much I mean, I agree with that point, and to say, I suppose, what's the best way to organise those sorts of discussions? What's the best way to ensure that we are hearing and learning and taking on board those lessons? Do we need to organise more webinars, events, or is it more kind of more kind of round table type discussions? Or an hour webinar is great for highlighting issues, but doesn't really allow you to get into the detail of what should be done next. If you had thoughts on that, I mean, either now or afterwards, get in touch and let's talk.
I think it's interesting, sorry, just to come in before Layla responds to Claire's comment, looking at the different theories and approaches that have been used by feminist activists, particularly in the global south, to those that have been used by feminist activists in the global north. In the global north, we have always, taken for granted some of the systems and structures which we work in, which means we have always worked or typically in at least the last 100 years, in a very institutionalized way in terms of our activism and our lobbying. And we have been used to quite close relationships with our government and a whole different way of advocacy and activism. And I think what has been interesting in the past few years, as some of those government doors have gone slamming shut to lobbyists and activists that were used to having that access, there has been a rush for some, not all, feminist activists in the global north to figure out how they maintain their access and how they maintain those relationships, or self-censoring to an extent, and looking at, particularly, within the US. And I think I was speaking to a lot of colleagues based in the global south when this happened, because there's a lot of fear, understandably, with a lot of feminist activists in the global north who have the privilege of dealing with some of this censorship and some of these challenges for the first time, whereas they have sisters in the global south who for decades and decades and centuries have been working in these incredibly oppressive, constrained environments, and that hasn't led to them capitulating on language, but has led to them, as we've said, doing that radical reimagination of what that looks like, and still figuring ways to push and to be true to their feminist core. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for those of us who work in some of these donor countries as we move forward, to figure out if we keep working with that existing model of engaging with those donors and doing that more traditional sort of institutionalized advocacy in feminism, or where we learn those lessons from our sisters who have created radical change in a number of global south countries that hasn't followed traditional models of advocacy that we think of here. But would love to be a part of that conversation. And there's some incredible theorists and authors as well that have written on this who are really incredible. But I'll pass to Layla to answer on Claire's question as well.
You, Claudia, and you actually linked a lot to what I was going to address the question with. So Claire is asking rightly if, couldn't this huge changes in aid coming from largely colonial and imperial powers be the spark for change? And she highlighting that she doesn't want to be naive or unrealistic. And I don't think the question is naive or unrealistic at all, but I can tell you what our experience has shown. For those on the front line in the global south, the simple answer is it's very unlikely. And the reason for that is that level of scarcity and pressure and cuts is cutting the lifeline of organizations. It's reducing bandwidth, and it's getting people to channel their vision. And it's unlikely that this is going to be the spark that brings change. It's breaking people's back. And I have seen how such level of pressure takes feminist theorists into camps to distribute sandwiches, because there's no level of debate that's going to get children fed. So they want to actually grab their sandwiches and pass them on. So although it's theoretically possible, I don't see it happening on the front line. I think we're going to lose the wealth of knowledge and experience, the more this pressure happens, the more wealth of experience and knowledge in the global south and with those most affected that we're going to lose. However, my personal hope is that, as Claudia said, for those with proximity to power who well-intendedly have believed that, it's not so bad, and, colonial powers that are colonial and imperial at heart could do well and could be trusted at the long term. And, the margin, the silver lining could be enough for us to have this as a moment of reckoning. Realize it's not going to be, you can either, feed, and you are more proximate to power than most people, hardest impacted. So it's a great moment of repositioning for those who were not aware of the level of proximity to power and decision and privilege. And that would be great for the movement. Thanks.
Can I just follow in, or are we?
Yes, please.
I would just really agree with what Layla said and say we've got some research that's coming out soon that looks at, for country case studies where women's movements were defunded rapidly or the civic space closed, and then tracking that to gender equality indicators, right? And you just see this direct either stagnation or really significant declines because the groups, without the funding and the support, have really faded into silence, right? And I think that's what Layla's saying, right? Was that now it is that groups are closing and it's happening now, and it's not, they'll stop again in a little bit when more money can move, that it's infrastructure that's getting lost. And at the same time, I think that there are those people with the proximity to power, people sitting in foundations, people sitting in government, donors, who are very actively trying to imagine a world that is beyond their money, but trying to control what that world looks like, right? And having nations and developing the think pieces and having the retreats. And that what's really important and what we're spending a lot of time in the Alliance for Feminist Movements right now thinking about is how do we make sure that movements are part of those conversations that are happening over here, right? That are saying, what is this innovative financing model? How can we get return on our investments? And those conversations are happening because those are closing. But make sure that the feminist movements are set up so that as we move to this new world, that we are still there and we are resourced to continue to doing this life-saving work. So we haven't cracked that nut yet. We are really working on it. But just to say that while, I think groups are fighting for their survival, those other conversations are still happening, and that those of us that are able to do those and participate those, it's really important that we are setting up our movements so that as that new world comes into being, we're part of it.
Yeah, it's extremely important to think about repositioning and rethinking the way we do things, and it's not in the current context. It's not going to be business as usual anymore. I am really sorry we are running over a little bit, but we have a few questions. I saw that you answered some of them, Rachel, and thank you very much for that. We have a question from Lily Norris, who says, how can international funders reshape their strategies to address not only gender-based violence, but also the colonial and environmental dimensions of these violations? And I think many of you covered that. What she also says, what models of reparative intersectional funding do you see as emerging or necessary to support feminist and indigenous-led resistance in Brazil, but I think also in the global south in general? Who wants to take this question? I think it was covered by many of you already. We have Francesco asking if the panelists think that work in coalitions of women's rights organizations that would good coping strategies, and also one that addresses the long-term problems of women's movement If so, how can coalitions be adequately funded when the funding system is so project-based it requires traditional administrative structure? I think this draws again on the failure of the current system that we have, funding system, and the necessity of creating new discussions and new strategies based on solidarity among ourselves. Eligeta asked if there is any advocacy on the MMF happening. I know of one led by the European Gender Budgeting Network. So I think Chevan posted our email address on the chat. So do please get in touch, and I'm happy to link you up. And then Laura asks, are there practical examples of what feminist movements have done in the past that could be adapted to the current context?
I can just jump in very quickly about this, and I think practical example. I think the feminist movement, like in Syria under the Assad regime, has really done really marvelous organizing, like within a lot of oppressive context. I think we did like one webinar. It was at the Global Fund for Women with like some of the donors, which was really interesting. That we were listening to Syrian activists to let us know how did they navigate. I think every context, of course, is different, but there is a pattern, right? Because this is systematic oppression. So we were talking about systems, and so as contexts are different, there's also like a lot of like a lot of strategies that are really interesting. I've been listening lately to some Sudanese activists who were telling me about how women within families, they actually always have, it's like they do it even like in weddings, right? Like they always have a box where women put like small money in it, and then that money is shared with everyone. Someone needs it. There's a lot of like small, really strategies that indigenous populations have been doing, plus also organizations and also feminists within oppressive contexts have been using. So so there is really like a lot of examples. I think we need to organize ourselves more to hear this. And the questions about also the strategies. I think right now in the beginning when all of this happened, there were like a lot of state of fear. So kind of like a freezing moment for all of the organizations. So we were not really even just trying to assimilate what's happening. So these researchers that are coming out now, the impact and all, the next phase we're looking at is actually strategizing. So I think also it's about timing. Hopefully that with timing, we're already seeing a lot of conversations happening. We just hope that, as it was mentioned right now, that it centers the movements in the center, and that's how we can move forward as a collective. But hoping that in the, some time, getting out of the freezing and the panic mode to the organizing, and this is hopefully that we're going to be doing, and hopefully that we will have more conversations about solutions and strategies and invitations for people to collaborate. And thank you.
Anything to add, Laila, Rachel, Claudia, Marianne?
I think I'd just add, because I saw another question in the chat about how international donors can act. And I think that even while we're in this, constrained funding environment, or an environment where we've made specific political choices, there are donors like the UK or countries like the UK, for better or for worse, still have a really key role in the international system. They are still, empowered with huge amounts of privilege in the roles that they hold on the UN Security Council, within the UN itself, in a number of international financing institutions. And even with that lack in ODA that they're contributing, they can still be a real ally to the global feminist movement by the rights they choose to defend and the language they choose to defend in these texts, and how they choose to respond to or not to respond to anti-rights actors that are very loud and vocal in these spaces. And unfortunately, I don't think that's something that we've seen hugely from countries like the UK, but it's something that we are certainly putting to them. That's even if you are withdrawing from the way in which you have previously supported, which is through the global aid system, you still have a huge role to play as a defender of hard-won rights and freedoms, and by choosing the language that you use carefully, and by being brave and having courage in the rights that you defend in the international system. So I just think that's something also to really keep on at some of these key global north governments about. Is it's not just aid budgets, and the solidarity that they owe women and that they owe the global feminist movement doesn't stop with their money. It's also the actions and the language that they use and how they show up in those international spaces as well. So that was just an additional point I wanted to make. And it was also because I saw someone mentioning financing for development in the chat, and particularly disappointed about the way that the UK has chosen to show up at that and at, G7 negotiations, etc. And I think it's important that we keep the pressure on there with the power that they do have in those spaces still. Thanks.
Any final words before we wrap up? Leila, Marianne, Rachel.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Francesco's question, and I'm not sure I'm getting exactly what coalitions might mean in that sense. I feel like most feminist movements tend to be very deeply coalitional in the way that work happens. I do think that in this moment where there's a lot of pressure on the funding, we're going to get pressure, for groups to come together. And I think that it's an important time for civil society groups to be really thoughtful about the way that we can share some of those back-end resources, some of our operational cost, while still maintaining the diversity and flourishing of our as resources shrink, the pressure to merge groups together will grow, and that it's important for us to have that, that imagination, that creativity to say, okay, what else can we do? Because I think that so much of our power and the beauty of our movements is that diversity of voices, experiences, perspectives, ways of organizing, and that I worry about a future of our movements that gets flattened by the need to merge. And so again, right, that call for creativity, which sounds really, I don't know, it's hard because, like, on the one hand, yes, like, it's not a luxury, we have to do it, and also we're so exhausted, and so it's a real tension. It's a hard thing to do, what we're asking of ourselves right now.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone, for coming here and joining the discussion today. And as we heard from our different panelists, the funding crisis is not just about money, because there is enough money, and way more than enough in the world. It's the way it's distributed. It's an issue of political will, equity, and power, access, justice, and care. But there is hope and there is strategy that we can, and we should, and we must start to join forces and put in place. We have also tools like GRB and other tools that we can use. We have stories, and we have, most importantly, each other to rely on. Thank you so much for this conversation. Please do stay in touch, and we will see you soon in another webinar. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Leila. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Siwar, Claudia. And thank you, Siobhan, for helping. And have a good rest of the day or evening, wherever you are based.